A half-ton steer slammed sideways into the corral rails. A man went down under it, pinned in the mud, the breath crushed out of him. Something snapped in his hip. He heard the bone give way, a dull, wet crack, and the world went white. He screamed once, then bit it off. The steer kicked free and ran. He lay, both hands clawing the dirt, trying to drag a leg that would never answer again. That was years back. The limp stayed. From then on, Eli Crdef worked his failing ranch alone, leaning on an old cattle dog more than any living person. He decided nobody could love a broken man on a mortgaged piece of dirt. He was wrong. Then a widow started bringing him supper. And what did she whisper on that cold porch that brought a hard old rancher to tears? Stay with me on this one. Here is what you need to understand about Eli Crdef. He woke before the sun every day because the day did not care that his hip was broken. He swung his legs off the bed, and there was always that first moment where the leg wouldn't take his weight, and he had to grab the bedpost and breathe through it. Then he reached for the cane he'd carved himself out of mesquite, and he stood, and he went to work. The ranch was 400 acres of hill country that had been in his family 3 generations. Limestone and cedar and a creek that ran low most of the year. Once it had carried 200 head of cattle. Now it carried 40, and half of those were getting old, and Eli couldn't afford to replace them. He couldn't hire hands. So the fences sagged. The barn roof leaked. The west pasture had gone to brush because he couldn't ride out that far anymore without paying for it in pain that lasted 3 days. He did it all with Banjo. Banjo was a blue heeler, gray in the muzzle now, with one ear that stood up and one that flopped. The dog did the running that Eli's leg couldn't. A whistle and a wave of the hand, and Banjo would push the cattle through a gate, hold them in a corner, bring back a stray from the brush. The two of them had worked out a whole language without words. When Eli's leg gave out in the far pasture once and he sat in the dirt for an hour gathering the strength to stand, Banjo lay down beside him and waited, and didn't make a sound, and that was the closest thing to comfort Eli had felt in a long time. He'd had a wife, years ago, before the accident. She'd passed from a fever when they were both young, and he never found another, and after the steer broke him, he stopped looking. A man looks in the mirror at a stooped frame and a leg that drags, and he does the arithmetic. He decided he wasn't worth the trouble. He decided it so thoroughly that it became the bedrock of who he was. And then there was the note at the bank. Eli owed the First Cattlemen's Bank of Care County $1,100 against the land. The note came due at the end of the year. He'd been paying the interest by selling off calves and doing without, but the principal sat there like a stone, and he had no real plan to move it. He didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about much. When folks asked after him at church, he'd say, "Gettin' by," and tip his hat and limp on. Now here's the thing about a man like that. The pride that keeps him standing is the same pride that keeps him alone. He couldn't tell the difference anymore between strength and stubbornness. They felt the same from the inside. That was the man Margaret Pell walked up to one cold Sunday in October with a covered basket in her hands. She was a widow, 50-some, who taught the little ones at the schoolhouse in town. Her husband had died in the war and left her with a son she'd raised alone. She had gray in her hair and flour on her apron most days, and a way of looking at a person straight on that made them feel seen. After Sunday service, she came down the church steps, walked across the gravel to where Eli stood by his old truck, and held out the basket. "I made too much supper," she said. "I'd be obliged if you take some off my hands." Eli looked at the basket like it might bite him. "I don't need charity, ma'am." "It isn't charity," Margaret said. "It's pot roast, and I'd be insulted if you called my pot roast charity." He didn't have an answer for that, so he took the basket. And Banjo, sitting in the truck bed, thumped his tail against the metal like the whole thing had been his idea. That was how it started. Margaret came the next Sunday and the one after. Every week the same. A basket set in his hands, no fuss. Pot roast, then chicken and dumplings, then a beef stew with cornbread that Eli ate standing at his kitchen counter because he didn't trust himself to sit across from how good it made him feel. Sometimes she stayed a minute on the porch and talked about nothing. The weather, the school, a boy who'd put a frog in her desk drawer. She never pushed. She never asked about his leg. She just stood there in the cold with her hands folded and talked and looked at him straight on. And Eli, who had spent years building a wall so high that nobody could see over it, felt a single brick come loose. It scared him more than the steer ever had, because he knew what was happening. He could feel himself wanting something he'd told himself he had no right to want. And a man who has made peace with being alone, when that peace starts to crack, he doesn't feel hope. He feels danger. He starts looking for the exit before the thing can hurt him. The Sundays piled up into weeks. November came in hard and gray. The grass browned and the creek dropped, and the cattle huddled in the lee of the cedar breaks. Eli started watching the road on Sunday afternoons without admitting to himself that he was watching it. When Margaret's little tan sedan turned in at his gate and rattled up the drive, something in his chest lifted that he immediately tried to push back down. One evening she handed him the basket and didn't leave right away. She nodded at the dog. He limps now too, same side as you. Eli looked down at Banjo. She was right. The old dog favored his left hind, and Eli hadn't even noticed it creep in, the way you don't notice your own face aging. "He's getting old," Eli said. "So are we all," said Margaret. And she smiled, and there was nothing sad in it, just a plain fact shared between two people who'd lived long enough to know it. "I'll see you Sunday, Eli." She drove off. Eli stood on the porch holding the warm basket and watched her taillights bounce down the drive and out the gate, and he stood there long after she was gone. Banjo leaned against his good leg. The wind picked up out of the north and rattled the loose tin on the barn. And Eli C. Ardef thought, for the first time in years, about what it might be like to not be alone. Then he thought about the $1,100 and the dragging leg, and the way a woman like that deserved a whole man on whole land. And he closed the thought up tight and went inside to eat his stew at the counter, standing up in the dark. What he didn't know was that the easy part was already over, because 3 days later, a letter came that turned everything hard. The letter came on a Wednesday, brought out by the mail rider along with a seed catalog and a notice about the cattle auction. Eli almost didn't open it. The return address said First Cattlemen's Bank, and he figured he knew what was inside. He figured wrong about the timing. The note wasn't due at the end of the year anymore. It was due in 3 weeks. Eli read it twice at the kitchen table, his thumb pressing the paper flat. The bank had been bought out. A larger outfit out of San Antonio had taken over First Cattlemen's, and the new owners were calling certain notes to current terms. That was the language. What it meant was simple. Pay $1,100 by the 1st of December, or the bank takes the land. He sat there a long while. Banjo put his chin on Eli's knee. There was no way to find $1,100 in 3 weeks. The cattle wouldn't sell for that, not the way the market was, not the old stock he had. He could sell the truck and it wouldn't be half. He had $90 in a coffee can on the shelf, and that was the sum of his wealth. He drove into town the next morning. The bank had a new man at the desk, young, soft-handed, in a suit that fit too well. His name was Harlan Voss, and he was the new manager sent up from San Antonio, and he had a way of smiling that never reached his eyes. "Mr. C. Ardef," Voss said, "I sympathize, I truly do, but the note is the note. We've got investors now, and investors want performing assets." He folded his hands on the desk. "I'll be straight with you. The land's worth more than the debt, a good deal more. If you can't pay, the bank takes it, sells it, and frankly comes out ahead. Some of us would rather see that happen than not. The smile. There's a development concern interested in that whole stretch along the creek. Water rights, you understand. So that was it. They weren't just collecting a debt. They wanted the land. The note coming due early wasn't bad luck. It was a door being held open for a man to fall through. Eli stood up. His leg had stiffened in the chair and it nearly buckled, and he caught the edge of the desk, and he saw Voss watch him do it. He saw the young man file it away. Weak, old, won't be a problem. Good day, Eli said, and limped out. He didn't go to church that Sunday. He told himself it was the leg, that the cold had it locked up bad. But the truth was he couldn't face Margaret, because something had hardened in him over those 3 days at the kitchen table, and it had a shape, and the shape was this. He was going to lose the land. He was 62 years old, broke, crippled, and about to be put off the only piece of ground he'd ever known. And here was this good woman bringing him pot roast and standing on his porch talking about frogs in desk drawers, looking at him like he might be worth something. He couldn't take it. He couldn't let her tie herself to a sinking man. He'd seen it before in his own father, a proud man who dragged his wife down into bitterness and poverty and called it love. Eli would not do that. He decided it the way he decided everything, with his jaw set and his mind closed. So when Margaret's tan sedan turned in at the gate that Sunday afternoon, 2 days after he'd skipped church, Eli was waiting on the porch, not glad, braced. Banjo stood up beside him and wagged, traitor that he was, and trotted down the steps to meet her. She came up the path with the basket. She'd worried he could see it. "You weren't at service," she said. "I thought maybe the leg." "Leg's fine." She stopped at the bottom of the steps. She looked at his face and she read something there the way she read everything, straight on. Her smile faded, not into hurt, just into watchfulness. "Eli, what's happened?" And here is where a wiser man would have told her the truth. Would have said, "The bank's taking my land and I'm scared, and I don't know what to do." But Eli C. Ardef had spent his whole life turning fear into stone, and he did it now, the only way he knew. "You shouldn't keep common out here, Margaret," he said. She went still. "It's a long drive," he said, "and the road's bad and folks talk. A schoolteacher's got a reputation to mind." The words came out flat and rehearsed because he had rehearsed them, lying awake at 3 in the morning. "You've been kind, kinder than I had any right to, but there's nothing out here for you. I'm a broke old man on borrowed dirt, and that's all I'm ever gonna be." For a long moment she didn't say anything. The wind moved the cedar. Banjo looked between them, ears working, sensing the change in the air the way a dog does. "Is that what you think?" Margaret said quietly. It wasn't a question. "It's what I know." She set the basket down on the bottom step, slowly, and Eli braced himself for her to turn and go, because that was the plan, that was the whole point, to make her go before he could ruin her. He told himself the ache in his chest was relief, but she didn't go. She stood there in the cold with her hands at her sides, and she looked at him a long time, and then she nodded once, slow, like a woman accepting a hand of cards she'd been dealt. "All right, Eli," she said, "all right." And she picked the basket back up and she turned and she walked back to her car and she drove away. The drive was empty. The porch was empty. Banjo whined low in his throat and looked up the road where the sedan had gone, then looked back at Eli like he wanted to know what in the world Eli thought he was doing. Eli went inside. He sat down at the table in the dark. For the first time in 3 years, his hip didn't hurt the worst of him. He'd done the right thing. He'd protected her. He told himself that over and over, and outside the wind died down and the evening went quiet and still, the kind of quiet a man mistakes for peace. He thought it was over. He thought he'd settled it. He had no idea what was coming up that road in the morning. The knock came at first light. Eli had barely gotten his leg under him, hadn't even put the coffee on, when Banjo lifted his head and gave one short bark and there were boots on the porch boards. Eli opened the door and it wasn't Margaret. It was Harlan Voss, and behind him a second man, broad in a canvas coat with a clipboard. "Morning, Mr. Crdef," Voss said, that smile already in place. "Didn't want to wait on the mail. Thought I'd save us all some time and come out personal." He gestured at the man with the clipboard. "This is Mr. Dell. He's a surveyor. We'd like to walk the creek frontage this morning, get our measurements in order, for when the property changes hands." Eli's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Note's not due for 2 more weeks." "It isn't," Voss agreed. "But let's be men about it, shall we? You can't pay, we both know that, so I'm offering you a kindness. Sign the deed over now, quiet, no auction, no notice tacked up on the courthouse door for the whole county to read. Walk away with your dignity." He took a folded paper from his coat. "I even brought $100 cash for your trouble. Call it a moving expense." There it was. The thing had changed its nature entirely. This was no longer a man and a bank and a number on a page. This was a man standing on Eli's own porch at dawn with a deed in his hand and a surveyor at his back, come to take the ground out from under a crippled old man before he'd even had his coffee, betting that Eli was too weak and too tired to fight. And the worst of it, the thing that turned Eli's stomach to ice, was that Voss was right. He couldn't pay. There was no card left to play. "Get off my porch," Eli said. Voss sighed like a patient man dealing with a child. "Mr. Crdef. I said get off my porch." Eli straightened up to his full height, the legs screaming, and he didn't let it show. "You can come back when you got the law with you and not a day before. And you can walk my creek when it's yours and not while it's mine. Now go." Something cold flickered behind Voss's eyes. The smile thinned out. "2 weeks," he said. "Then I come back with the sheriff, and there won't be any $100 on the table." He stuffed the paper back in his coat. "Enjoy them." He turned and went down the steps, the surveyor trailing after, and they got in their car and drove off. And Eli stood on the porch shaking, gripping the rail until they were gone. "Now listen. I want to stop here for just 1 second because if you've made it this far, you already know this is the kind of story that stays with you. If it's holding you the way it's holding me, do me a favor and tap that subscribe button. It's the only thing that keeps stories like this one getting told. All right. Back to Eli, alone on his porch with 2 weeks to lose everything. He didn't tell Margaret. Of course he didn't. He'd sent her away precisely so she wouldn't be standing next to him for this. He spent the next days the only way he knew how, working. He patched what he could patch. He counted the cattle like counting them might change the number. He sold the good saddle in town for $40 and a young rancher's pity, and he put the 40 in the coffee can, and the can held $130 now against $1,100, and he stopped doing the arithmetic because the arithmetic was cruel. And then the second blow landed, and it came from a direction he never watched. It was the storekeeper in town, Prout, who told him. Eli had come in for nails and flour, and Prout leaned over the counter and lowered his voice. "You hear about the school teacher, Ms. Pell?" Eli's heart dropped. "What about her?" "That bank fella, Voss, been around her something fierce, walking her home from the schoolhouse, sent flowers to the boarding house. Word is he's set on marrying into a respectable family name to settle himself in the county." Prout shook his head. "Funny thing is, folks say she's not having it, but he's not the sort to take no easy. And she's a widow alone, Eli. A man like that can make life hard for a woman alone." Eli stood at the counter holding a sack of nails, and the whole thing turned over in his mind, and it was so much worse than he'd thought. Voss wanted the land for the water, and Voss wanted Margaret for the standing. The same man, reaching for both with the same soft hands, and Eli had sent Margaret away. had stood on his porch and told her there was nothing out there for her, had pushed her right out into the cold, right into the path of the man who'd come to take everything. He'd thought he was protecting her. He'd left her undefended. He drove home with his jaw clenched so hard it ached. Banjo sat in the passenger seat and watched him, and somewhere on that road between the store and the gate, something in Eli C. Ardef finally broke the other way. All those years he'd turned fear to stone to keep himself alone. Now the fear was for her and the stone wouldn't hold, and underneath it was something he'd buried so long he'd forgotten it was alive. He had to make it right. Pride be damned, leg be damned, $1,100 be damned. He had to go and tell her the truth, all of it, and stand in front of her like a man whether he had anything to offer or not. He got home at dusk, and there, parked at his gate, was a little tan sedan. Margaret was sitting on his porch steps in her coat with a basket beside her, and Banjo was out of the truck and across the yard to her before Eli had the door open. She stood up. In the failing light, he couldn't read her face. He came across the yard slow, the cane biting into the cold ground. "You sent me away," Margaret said before he could speak, "and I let you. For 2 weeks I let you because I figured a man's got a right to his own door." Her voice was steady, but there was a tremble under it. "And then I heard from Prute's wife that the bank's taking your land, that Harlan Voss is putting you off this place. And I sat in my kitchen and I understood why you said what you said." She lifted her chin. "You weren't pushing me away because you didn't want me, Eli C. Ardef. You were pushing me away because you thought you weren't worth keeping." Eli stopped at the bottom of the steps. The truth was out, laid bare by her and not by him, and he had no stone left to hide behind. The wind came cold off the north pasture, and Banjo pressed against his leg. "Margaret," he said, and his voice cracked on it, "you deserve better than a broken old rancher and a mortgaged piece of dirt. You always did. I haven't got anything. In 2 weeks I won't even have the ground I'm standing on. That Voss, he's after you and he's a wolf, and I sent you straight at him because I was too proud and too scared to keep you close." He shook his head. "I've got nothing to give you. Nothing but a bad leg and an old dog and a load of debt. You deserve better than me. That's the whole of it. That's God's truth." For a moment Margaret didn't move. Then she came down the steps. She came right up to him, close, closer than she'd ever stood, and she reached out and took his hand, his right hand, the one scarred white across the back from a barbed wire years ago, and she held it in both of hers. She was crying. He could see it now, the tears on her face in the last of the light, but she was smiling through them, and she leaned up close to his ear, so close he could feel the warmth of her breath in the cold, and she whispered the one thing he never expected to hear in all his life. "You pulled my boy out of the Guadalupe River 8 years ago," she whispered. "In the flood. You don't even know it was him. You don't even remember his face. But I do. And there is no better man than you. There never was." Eli went absolutely still. The flood, 8 years back. He remembered it the only way you remember a thing you did without thinking. The Guadalupe had jumped its banks in a spring storm, brown and roaring, and he'd been driving the low road and seen a wagon swept sideways and a boy in the water, a boy going under, maybe 10 years old, screaming and then not screaming. And Eli had gone in. His leg was already bad by then. The steer had already broken him, but he didn't think about the leg. He went off the bank into that cold, killing water and got an arm around the boy and fought the current to a snag and held on until men came with a rope. He'd torn his hip up worse doing it. He'd limped harder ever after. He never knew the boy's name. The family was from down county, somebody said, passing through. He'd gone home soaked and shaking and never spoke of it, because to Eli it wasn't a story, it was just a thing a man does when a child is drowning. "Thomas," Margaret said, still holding his hand against her chest now, both her hands wrapped around his. "My son, my only boy, you gave him back to me. You ruined your leg saving a child who wasn't yours, and you went home and you never told a soul and you never asked a thing in return." The tears ran down. "I have known for 2 years it was you. Prout told me the way he tells everybody everything, and I started coming to church here, and I started bringing you supper. And you thought it was pity." She laughed, a wet, broken laugh. "Pity, Eli. I have loved you for 2 years from across a churchyard, too scared to say it, and you stood on this porch and told me I deserve better." She pressed his scarred hand harder. "There is no better. You are the best man I have ever known. The only one who ever gave me back something I thought I'd lost for good." Eli Ciardef, who had not wept since he was a boy, who had taken a steer's full weight and bitten off his own scream, stood in his cold yard and felt his face break. The cane slipped. Margaret caught his arm, and he put his forehead down against hers and he wept, and she held him up, the two of them swaying there in the dark, and Banjo circled them once and lay down across both their feet like he meant to keep them there. "I've got nothing," Eli got out. "Margaret, the land." "Hush," she said. "Hush now, we'll come to the land." The land came the next morning, and it came in a way Eli never saw coming either. Margaret hadn't driven out to his place alone. She'd spent those 2 weeks doing the thing Eli had never once in his life been able to do. She'd told people. She'd gone to Prout at the store, and to the preacher, and to the families whose children she taught, and quietly, without fuss, she told them what the new bank was doing to Eli Ciardef, the man who'd pulled the Pell boy from the flood. She told them the whole county had a debt to that man, whether they knew it or not. And the hill country, it turned out, did not care for a soft-handed man from San Antonio coming up to take a crippled rancher's ground. They came on the 1st of December. Voss came too, with the sheriff and the deed, smiling, sure of himself. But the yard was already full of trucks. Prout was there, the preacher, 6 ranchers and their wives, the young man who'd bought Eli's saddle come to give it back. And they had with them a coffee can of their own, except it wasn't a can. It was a real sum, gathered $5 and $10 and $20 at a time across a whole county, by a school teacher who'd spent 2 weeks knocking on doors. $1,100, and 40 more on top, for good measure. The preacher counted it out onto the hood of the sheriff's car while Voss watched, and the smile drained off the young man's face for good. The sheriff, who'd known Eli his whole life and hadn't liked this errand from the start, took the money and counted it again himself and turned to Voss and said, "Notes paid. In full. You got no business here now, son. I'd get back to San Antonio if I were you." Voss looked around that yard at 40 hard faces, and he understood that he had badly misjudged where he was. He got in his car. He drove off. Eli never saw him again, and neither did Margaret, and the water rights along the creek stayed where they'd always been. When the trucks had gone and the yard was quiet, Eli stood on his porch with the paid note in his hand, the actual stamped paper that said the land was his, free, the first time it had been free in his lifetime. He could not speak. Margaret stood beside him. Banjo lay in the last patch of winter sun, his gray muzzle on his paws, his bad leg stretched out the same side as Eli's. "I don't know how to take all this," Eli said finally. "A man works his whole life and asks for nothing. I don't know how to be given to." "You'll learn," Margaret said. "You've got time, we both do." They were married in the spring in the little church in town, with the whole county packed into the pews and spilling out the doors. Margaret's son Thomas came home for it, a grown man now, 19, tall, and he walked up to Eli before the ceremony and shook his hand and couldn't get a single word out, and didn't need to. Eli looked at the boy he'd pulled from the river and saw a young man alive in the world because of one cold morning 8 years gone, and that was a wage that no money could match. Eli kept the ranch, with Margaret's teacher's salary steady alongside the cattle, and the fences mended by neighbors who suddenly seemed to find reasons to come help. The spread stopped failing and started, slow, to come back. The west pasture got cleared. The barn roof got patched. 40 head became 60. It was never going to make a rich man of him, but it didn't have to. It only had to be home, and now it was home for 2. The leg never got better. Some mornings it was worse. But there's a difference, Eli learned, between a pain you carry alone in the dark at the counter and a pain you carry with a hand on your shoulder and a warm kitchen and a woman asking, "Did you sleep all right?" The first kind hollows a man out. The second kind, a man can live with the rest of his days. Banjo lived 2 more years. He died in his sleep on the porch in the sun, an old dog who'd done his work, and Eli buried him under the live oak by the gate and stood there a long while with his hat off. And Margaret stood with him, because that was the thing now, she stood with him. They never were apart again. Years later, when folks asked Eli Ciardef how a broke old crippled rancher had ended his days the happiest man in the county, he'd look out toward the creek, the same creek a soft-handed man once wanted to take from him. And he'd think about a steer and a broken hip, and a flooded river and a drowning boy, and how a thing that had broken him had also, without his ever knowing it, been the very thing that saved him. He went off that riverbank with a bad leg, because the leg never stopped him from doing what a man ought to do. And that day put him in the path of a woman who'd loved him for it before he'd ever spoken a word to her. "I spent half my life," he'd say, "thinking I had nothing to give. Turned out I'd already given the one thing that mattered. I just had to wait for somebody to come tell me so." Then he'd reach over and take Margaret's hand, the same scarred old hand she'd held that cold evening on the porch, and he'd go quiet, the way he always did when his heart was too full for talking. And that was answer enough.